So it's maybe a slightly different kind of talk. I see there are a few students that I do know, but most of architectural discussion and talks, as well as publications, generally discuss built work, and it's a very particular mode of discussing built work. You know, there was the first review of our major architectural journal in South Africa that was done a few years ago. And one of the things they say in that journal is that there is the mode of discourse, the mode of discussing architecture that we have in South Africa is very self-congratulatory. You know, it's generally writers talking about their built work in a very praiseworthy kind of ways. So I'm not really going to show you a work that I've done, although I was a practicing architect for many years. But what I want you to do, what I want to try to help you to do as students in postgrad, is to actually just take a step back a little bit. You are all immersed in your projects and your courses, and it's very difficult for you as students to actually take a step back to look at your discipline with a bit of critical distance. And it's even difficult for practitioners to do that. And it's even difficult for academics to do that, right? So that's what I'm going to try to do today, to help you to have some kind of critical distance, to almost take a step back from this discipline you are studying and try to look at it with a little bit more perspective. You know, to have this perspective, you need to put a little bit of distance between things. So I wanted to talk to you about architecture's politics. Architecture has got a particular kind of politics. And you'll see what I mean. And I want to begin with a story. In the late 80s, specifically 1986, in Gauteng, which was then called the Transvaal, there was a small group of architects. So the late 80s, this is the last years of apartheid. And there was a group of architects, small in numbers, who wanted to challenge, take an ethical position against the ways that architecture, the discipline and the profession, was completely enmeshed in apartheid modes of thinking and practice. The government was the biggest client of the architectural profession. And so architecture was thoroughly immersed in apartheid and colonial thinking and ideology and practices. And this little group of architects wanted to take some kind of ethical position from the profession. There were many other professions that had were starting to do that, and in later years we would see more of it as well. So one of the things that they took issue with was something claimed by many people in the architectural establishment. The idea that architecture, as they put it, was an autonomous apolitical activity. You know, so this little group, which called themselves AAP, Architects Against Apartheid, coming now in the late 80s, are speaking to a discipline that imagines itself as completely apolitical, right? So architecture is at this time is a discipline that sees itself as completely removed from the social political spectrum and fabric of its society, even though it is completely enmeshed in it, right? So it is thoroughly through and through enmeshed in the social and political climate of its time, but claims precisely the opposite, claims that it is not so, right? And this little group, which call themselves the acronym ARP, Architects Against Apartheid, were challenging this idea. And one of the things that they say was that that architecture's immersion for centuries in colonialism and apartheid was distorting the very moral and ethical basis of the profession, you know. So it means that our discipline has morals and has ethics, but it has suffered an incredible amount of distortion. The social environment and the political environment was completely distorting the very moral and ethical basis of the profession. So it has an ethics, but it's a very particular brand of ethics that is emerging out of a very particular kind of climate. Now, the point I want to highlight here is this idea of dissociating architecture from its social and political context. This is a very, very old idea. This is an idea that has been going on for, it comes out of, you know, the last decades of apartheid. And it is in fact a kind of a discourse and a kind of a discussion that is still with us to this day. So it might surprise you to know that most of the key kind of themes and concepts and ideas that we work with in architecture are not new. They are in fact very, very old. They have a lineage, you know, they have parents and grandparents who, you know, they have a long lineage, these ideas. They go back many, many decades. They are not often as new as they sometimes pretend to be. And this is one of those things, this idea that architecture is an autonomous, apolitical activity that operates separately from its political and social fabric. It has never been this way, okay? Now, today, we still have this kind of discourse. There's still very active attempts to imagine that architecture today, now, decades after the end of apartheid, can still be separated, can still be dissociated from its social context. You will still read publications that say this, very prominent academics and writers in our discipline that will still make this kind of an argument. So it's an argument that is very much still with us. And when you look at the research that has been happening over decades, there's actually very little research and publications out there that will actually discuss just how enmeshed architecture has been and remains with its the ideas and ideologies of its political environment. And because it is so thinly engaged, and because it is eschewed and there's a reluctance to really engage with it on a deep level as a discipline, what that means is that it remains vulnerable to be endlessly perpetuated, endlessly reproduced, and adapted into new forms, you know? So the point I'm trying to make is that the reluctance to speak about the tensions in our society within our discipline doesn't mean that those tensions go away. It simply means that they continue to be reproduced in new adapted forms, okay? So if we want to produce a different kind of a thinking and a different kind of an architecture, I would contend that you have to understand and engage with these things, okay? So you have in the main story, and you all will be familiar with the stories, the main story we have of South African history is generally a story of a journey and a struggle towards freedom and liberation and democracy from centuries of imperialism and colonialism and various forms of oppression. That is the general story you will have, okay? If you read Nelson Mandela's 1994 autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, that is precisely the argument, a long walk to freedom. If you go onto the South African government's official website, and you look at the official history on the government's website, that's the story. It is this journey toward freedom and democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And 1994 is generally the kind of the line in the sand which determines dramatic changes either side of it. But 1994 was a very, if you look at the world and the continent, 1994, a period where you start to have a democratic, some kind of democratic dispensation on the continent happens very, very late, right? South Africa is really one of It is the oldest significant colony on the continent, and it is also the last one left. Okay, so it's both the oldest significant one and the last colonial and imperial player left on the continent. So it covers an incredibly long span. Now, in our context, when we look at our discipline, a discipline that emerges in that context has to take the character, the color, the ideas of that long, centuries-long span, right? It's inevitable that it is going to do that. So what has happened in architecture after 1994 is not the very difficult work of actually confronting and reforming all of those structures. Rather what we will see is that in 1994, and you guys are a little bit too young, but there was a lot of euphoria around 1994. And in the late 90s, there was a real multicultural kind of a politics, you know, the rainbow nation, a South African people that could be united in their diversity, in all their different cultures and colors. You know, this was the idea. And this got taken up by architecture, and it has become really really important to architecture self-definition, that it has taken on this sort of this multicultural kind of a politics. But what this allowed for, what taking up this politics of the Mandela era in the late 90s allowed for, was the avoidance of virtually all topics that cause any kind of discomfort. That's what these discourses allow for. So, and we're going to see this more. I'm going to give you some examples. And this has remained very foundational in architecture. Virtually all our discourses are premised on this presumption, that we have moved towards this journey towards freedom and taking on the multicultural politics of the Mandela era. And then this allows for the avoidance of virtually every kind of topic that causes any discomfort. Tensions in our society, racial tensions especially. This is a big, big taboo in architecture, okay? Even though within just a decade, less than a decade from the late 90s, when these discourses really take root, it would already be discredited as what people now call rainbowism. You know, it's the idea that we can have a different kind of a society without addressing the very tangible things that cause the tensions and inequalities, right? This is now called rainbowism. So very quickly after Mandela, the Mandela politics was increasingly becoming criticized in society at large, and that remains so, but it remains foundational in architecture, okay? Now, I want to move on to give you some examples of this. This kind of presumption, these premises that are foundational to the concepts and ideas and theories we work with in architecture, really come forward in a whole myriad of ways. And I could sit here all day giving you different examples of how it does that. And the tensions that we speak of in South African society, the inequalities, they really resonate and reverberate and come to the fore in virtually every sphere of South African society, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on Twitter, whether you're, you know, sport or whatever. It's not very hidden in our society. It's very much on the surface of things, very much in the fore. But whatever the key crisis that we are dealing with in our society, it very much appears that architecture often appears to remain silent. You know, there could be a crisis at our doorstep, and very often it seems that architecture is silent about these things. So, for example, if you guys can, maybe you were still in school at the time, but in 2015 and 2016, there were these huge nationwide protests that happened across the whole country. Student and worker protests in the universities across the country, right? It really engulfed the whole society. It was on the news, it was in the newspapers, it was in social media, it was everywhere, absolutely everywhere, in 2015 and 2016. And these protests were known by various names. Roads must fall, outsourcing must fall, fees must fall especially, okay? Now, the whole society was engulfed by this. And there are 8 architectural schools in South Africa, 8 of them. All 8 of them were almost entirely silent, right? Remember where we're coming from. I'm leading you, I'm trying to make connections for you, okay? Remember, we have a discourse that historically has dissociated, or imagine that it is dissociated from its political context, right? That is the apartheid mode that architecture practiced under, okay? Now I'm giving you another example. We see a protest happening across the whole country. The whole country is engulfed by it. Even beyond the country, it's even influencing many other parts of the world. It's actually a kind of a global phenomenon. And now we see in the United States how statues are falling all over the place, right? And we could arguably that began with roads must fall, right? So this is a global phenomenon. But all our architectural learning schools, all 8 of them, were almost entirely silent in taking a public position, right? Even though there were protests within the very architecture schools themselves, right? It was not a situation happening out there. It was right under our noses, okay? And the silence suggests that architecture does not really beat with the pulse of its society. It's something that is quite removed in many ways, okay? It would appear like that. It would appear that architecture doesn't engage, right? If we look at the way it was in the 80s and then we look at this major national protest across our country, it would appear like it doesn't engage, right? But I would contend that it would be misreading the situation of architecture. Architecture is not something that doesn't engage. It's something that engages in very particular kinds of ways, okay? Because in the 1990s, architecture fully embraced the Mandela era politics. It fully embraced the Rainbow Nation and rainbowism, right? So it shows that it can engage, right? And right now in our time, we are looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? And I don't know if you follow on social media and follow the universities and the architecture schools, but many people have been having online meetings and online conferences, and there's been articles circulating about all sorts of very clever and creative ways about how this is going to affect architecture, how architecture can respond to it. And if you guys are on Facebook, and you follow the South African Institute of Architects, which is the institute of our profession, the voluntary institute. If you follow their Facebook page, you will see that from late March, when this pandemic hits in South Africa, and you can check this out for yourself, right? And it's a very prolific Facebook page, multiple posts every single day. Virtually every post on our institute's page, its official page, is dealing directly or indirectly with some aspect of the COVID crisis, right? So I'm trying to sketch out to you certain kinds of patterns, and I hope you can start picking it up, right? So we looked at how in the 80s, architecture doesn't engage, or it's completely immersed, but imagines that it isn't. It dissociates itself, right? But in the 1990s, just a decade later, it completely takes up the political project of Rainbow Nation, right? Then we see in 2015 and 2016, again, it doesn't engage at all. It's almost completely silent, right? And then converging with the COVID-19 pandemic, Black Lives Matter emerged onto the scene again, right? Which emerged a few years ago, and it re-emerged onto the global scene. And there were protests in cities across the world, and there were protests, concurrent protests in South Africa as well. Black Lives Matter protests happened in South Africa as well. And the government came out to make statements. Cyril Ramaphosa was making statements about it, various political parties, and many people were making direct relations between the issues being addressed by Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, and the way unlawful, as they argued, unlawful and excessive use of force was happening in South Africa by police as well. And especially, you know, there was a case of the person by the name of Collins Khoza, who was who died at his home in Alexandria in Johannesburg because he was beaten by police. So the point I'm getting to here is that we are seeing, if you look at it on the surface, it looks completely confused and haphazard. You know, in the 80s, it doesn't engage. In the 90s, architecture does engage, right? In 2015 and 2016, architecture doesn't engage. Black Lives Matter architecture doesn't engage. COVID-19, it does engage, right? So it's not a discipline that doesn't engage with its society. It does so, but where it does so and how it does so is actually very selective. We start to pick up certain kinds of patterns, right? So there's an enthusiasm with which rainbowism and COVID-19 was embraced, and a deafening silence with regards to things like Fees Must Fall and Black Lives Matter. So we can see that there are certain kinds of patterns, right? It's not haphazard, it's highly selective, it's deliberate, and it's very political, right? It's immersed in its politics regardless of what it may say. So what we end up is with the discipline, and I'm going to try to end as quickly as I can. We end up with a discipline that embraces certain kinds of topics such as related to multiculturalism, topics related to health, to the environment, to environmental sustainability. Architecture is very, very comfortable embracing these kinds of things, right? But there is an acute reluctance to engage with questions of race, with racialized experience, and virtually all kinds of topics and events which recall and implicate colonialism and apartheid, not in the past, but in the present, as issues we are dealing with still now, right? And that idea that it is in the past and not in the present, that we have journeyed towards this moment of freedom and liberation from all the oppressive aspects of our past. Remember, this is foundational to our discipline. And now when we have protests happening on our doorsteps across the country that say that that isn't so, that it hasn't been left in 1993, architecture doesn't really know how to deal with this because that is contrary to the very foundations of its self-definition. So it's an unnamed politics, but it's a very deliberate politics. And I hope you're picking up these patterns. So just to very quickly conclude, I want to just end with, because you guys are postgrad students, and I want to just encourage you with a few things. The people who study education have long distinguished between two kinds of curriculums, the formal curriculum and what they call a hidden curriculum, right? The formal curriculum is where you, you pick up your learning guide and it tells you the course is about this, this, and this, and you'll be, you have to do these kinds of things, and you'll be measured according to this, that, or the other, right? That's what your module guide says and your learning guide. That's like a formal curriculum. But you also have a hidden curriculum, or what they also call the real curriculum. These are all the things that are unsaid, that are unspoken. It's the norms, it's the expectations, it's all the kinds of presumptions that never gets spoken. And every education has got this. Every education system in the world will have explicit things and not explicit things. Things that are said, things that are not said. A formal curriculum, a hidden curriculum. And many students don't realize that you are all educated in these two kinds of curriculums. And very often it is the case that there is a disjunction between the two for some students. In the United States, where these kinds of theories emerged, it is very much minority students that would suffer the most from this disjunction, right? So in the United States, that would mean African-American students or other kind of minority ethnic groups who suffer, you know, as educationists who study this have said, they would suffer all kinds of consequences from this: personal anxiety, or they would, once they graduate, they will want nothing to do with education. And in our context, of course, it's not a minority. The Western-centric education that we have is something that the majority will experience. Will experience that disjunction, if you're following me. And when you do your theses, those of you who have theses, generally speaking, that are the most resolved, that have really answered all the questions that they've asked, will generally not be the ones that are going to make the most contribution in our discipline. Because it's really, and I've seen many examples of this, it is really students who have incredibly intelligent questions that they're asking in their work, but neither their lecturers nor the status quo in architecture really has answers to the kinds of things that they're asking, because they're not in sync with the formal, with neither the formal nor the hidden curriculum. They're not in sync with the norms and the expectations. They're coming from a different experience of the world. And those projects very often are the projects that are the most unresolved, because the discipline doesn't have answers for them. So what I want to encourage you is, as students, although it is nice to get good marks, don't at postgrad level be fixated with marks, because the marks only mean how much you have mastered, generally speaking, how much you have mastered the status quo. And the status quo is very limited. But if you have projects that are incredibly intelligent but unresolved, that hopefully can be the beginning of a journey for you, an intellectual and an ethical journey where you can actually make a contribution to your discipline. You can actually try to change both its formal curricula and its hidden curricula, all those presumptions and all those norms. Architecture doesn't really produce intellectuals, not really. It produces practitioners, okay? It produces practitioners who can produce beautiful buildings, but graduates who become people who can actually critique their discipline and step back from it and look at its structures and interrogate them and see how it reproduces its society. We don't really have people like that. We need people who are students who are asking the kinds of questions that we don't at the moment have the answers for, and we need lecturers and academics that can help them. So I want to encourage you, don't be, and I'll end here, don't be too fixated with mastering the very expected norms, but try to pursue your own journey and try to pursue the questions that are relevant to you and relevant to your experiences. And hopefully you have lecturers who can help you to do that. And those are actually the people that we actually really need as a discipline, that will actually take things forward and actually change things. So I'll end there, Ruth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for such a needed talk at this current time. And I'm sure you've touched on a lot of issues that all of us, and the students in particular, have been noticing. we've got time for questions. So I'm sure you guys have a lot to say. You've already had a thank you from Demi. While we're waiting for people to formulate questions, maybe you've been very clear talking about what students can do to reach into their ethical selves, to say what needs to be said, regardless of what course requirements might be. Maybe how could architecture stop being silent? What kind of a world could you imagine where architecture is not silent? In cases like Fismes Fall.
What are you asking? What would happen in order for it not to be silent? Is that what you're saying? Okay. Well,
what would you like to see, I guess?
Sorry?
I guess what would happen?
Like, what needs to happen, or what would I like to see?
It's two questions.
Okay. Well, look, what needs to happen is things are reproduced on multiple levels. So this is the first thing to acknowledge, that the norms that we deal with, which are deeply which emerge and are imbricated in apartheid and colonialism, those norms, the first thing to acknowledge is that they did not end. They did not end. And when we acknowledge that, then we have to study how they are reproduced. And we study how they are reproduced so that we do not reproduce them. You know, there is for example, a sentiment that if we discuss race, for example, which is one of the main tensions in our society, race and material inequalities, that if we discuss something like race, it would be perpetuating race, it would be racializing things. But these things are already with us, you know, and decades after the end of apartheid, it hasn't gotten any better. So that model hasn't worked for us, you know, and many theorists and surveys that have been done as well on education have shown how education is actually deepening and perpetuating all the kinds of tensions and distortions in our society. And we need to think of disciplines not as separate autonomous things, but as things that are completely immersed in their society, and they reproduce the society. And we don't want to reproduce the worst of it anymore, okay? That's one thing. Another thing that needs to happen, and this is a big taboo. If we look at who architects are, so architecture is not a discipline that landed from the moon and now we're all being taught this thing that came out of a spaceship. It's not really like that. Architecture comes from people, and people teach from their own experiences and their own particular viewpoints and their own position in society. Now, in South African society, about 9 out of 10 people are black, especially black African. And when we look at the who makes up the architectural profession, according to the SACAP registration figures, about 9 out of 10 are white, right? So architecture is almost the exact social inversion of its society. And one of the problems we are going to have inevitably is that we are going to teach a kind of architecture from our own positionality, from our own experiences. And the greatest thing architecture wants is to be able to have a discipline and a profession that is actually relevant to its society. And at the moment we have a small racialized and class grouping that is the inversion of the society it is speaking to. Okay, so it is crippled by its you know, the kind of monovocal voice, the particular positionality and experience, which is not reflective of its society. This is a huge problem. in the last few years, increasingly, the presidents of SACAP, the presidents of SAIA have all come out to speak very explicitly about we're actually in a crisis. The architectural discipline and profession is in a kind of a crisis. So this is another thing that needs to change, is who is speaking, who is writing, who is writing theory, you know, where are we taking our concepts from, whose experiences are we articulating, you know. So we need to, and this is another point for our students, is that we need new theorists, we need people to write theory, you know, we need people to develop the concepts that practitioners are going to start working with, you know. So at least one person in this postgrad cohort has to become a theorist, has to become an intellectual, you know, and you can be a practitioner at the same time. But the problems are just reproduced on multiple levels in who makes up architects, who writes architecture, who writes our theory, who teaches, who practices, who are the voices, you know. We really need students to be encouraged to not just rely on the existing knowledge base, but to actually produce new knowledge from us, from their own experiences. And they must challenge the status quo, because the status quo is very limiting. The status quo is in a crisis. You know, graduating in architecture is not about mastering the status quo, because the status quo is in a crisis. We need to actually challenge the status quo and write new kinds of theory and produce new kinds of thinking, and hopefully produce a different kind of a built environment as well.
Thank you. And this is really important when you're asked to write as well. Just because you're architects doesn't mean we don't need you to also contribute to the community and changing what architecture is. Everyone has a micro essay due next week, and
yeah,
we really like to emphasize writing is important.
Yeah,
sorry.
And it's writing is thinking, you know. I mean, when, you know, I could give you an example of when I was a student. You know, I was also sitting where students are sitting right now, and you know, when you're a student, you think everything is about design, and you think. You know, when I was a student, I wouldn't even read a book that didn't have pictures in it, pictures of architecture, you know. It's a discipline that is heavily reliant on visuality, you know, producing very beautiful graphics and images, and visual stuff is a part of our discourse. So these are the things we foreground the most: visuality, presentation, graphics, and design. But what you need to understand is that those things that you design, those forms that you make, those graphics that you produce are premised on certain kinds of ideas, right? And those ideas come from people. You must understand that there's a connection between these things. If you change the thinking, you are going to change what visual things and what material objects you design and spaces you design produce. Thinking is the foundation upon which design is premised, right? So don't just focus on the end of things. You also need to become thinkers, and thinking comes from people. So you need to become the people who become the thinkers, who become the writers, who produce a new kind of discourse that can hopefully change the designs that actually materialize.